My name is Mary Doyle-Kent. I'm a committee member in the Southeast region of Engineers Ireland, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Susanna O'Rourke this evening for her talk, Biomedical Engineering, and an unexpected title called The talk is An Unexpected Journey. So I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes just talking about Dr. Susanna O'Rourke. Dr. O'Rourke is the founder, member, and managing director of Trisco Consulting Limited, specializing in engineering, quality, and regulatory. Suzanne has a proven track record in the biomedical industry in the areas of design and development of controls, clinical investigation, usability, human factors, testing, design assurance, quality management systems, certification, sterilization, right through to regulatory approval with FDA and EU, and product launch readiness. So her areas of expertise span from startup to multinationals, including Mainstay Medical, Neuromode Devices, Stryker, Guidant, Boston Scientific, across a range of device classifications. Suzanne holds a primary degree in mechanical and materials engineering from TCD, Trinity College, Dublin, an MSc in medical technology, regulatory affairs from Cranfield, and her PhD is in biomedical engineering from the University of Limerick. She's also qualified in ISO 9001, ISO 13485. She's a lead auditor with experience in completing assessments for companies, managing systems across the diversity of medical device classifications. So Suzanne also currently represents the Biomedical Engineering Division at Engineers Ireland Council level and is an ex-chair of that division. This evening's presentation focuses on the diversity of opportunity available to engineers in the medical device biomedical sector. And Suzanne will draw on her experience from working in academia, in multinationals, and startup medical device companies, which incorporates research and development, process development, product performance and recalls as well, the good and the bad, and taking that experience to innovation, product approvals, and understanding the importance of working within the regulatory framework to get new products to the market. Suzanne will share her journey with us, and this journey is about the application of engineering to improving clinical options, patient outcomes, and treating unmet clinical need. She says that this is never a boring journey, and you never know where it's going to take you next. So her presentation will look at the realities and the challenges of working with startup medical companies and successfully converting that great idea, I suppose, into a commercial reality. Thank you, Suzanne. I'll hand it over to you now.
So first of all, my thanks to Mary for the introduction and also to the Engineers Ireland South East region for the invitation to talk to you this evening. As Mary said, I'm a mechanical and materials engineer by qualification. I've over 25 years experience across the medical device sector at this stage. I am an active member of Engineers Ireland. I'm a committee member with both the Biomedical Engineering Division and also the Thomond region. You can see the two logos of those divisions there on this slide. And I also represent the Biomedical Engineering Division at Engineers Ireland Council level. So this evening, and you can see a few pictures there on the slide of some of my favorite projects that I worked on over my career so far. And that's really what I'm going to focus on. I'm actually going to talk to you about things that I have worked on in my journey in engineering, and particularly in biomedical engineering so far. I'm only partway through, certainly not finished. And I'm going to start really at the beginning. I'm going to talk about how and why I got into engineering, how I transitioned across into bioengineering, because there were no courses in bioengineering when I started, and where I thought my career was going to be at, what my early career expectations were. and the assumption that I had that I would work in academic R&D, and ultimately I've spent most of my working career so far working in industry, and certainly more recently with a focus on innovative medical device products in the startup environment. I kind of feel that, you know, where I've ended up is quite different to where I started, and it is certainly quite different to where I thought I would be at the beginning. So, you know, literally going right back to the beginning, I went to school in Loreto Convent. So this is a picture of the school as it would have been at the time, Loreto Convent in Bray. And it's a long time ago now, but I was a member of the class of 1991. And, you know, I think one of the things that really stands out to me when I think back to how I got into engineering, you know, how I was choosing engineering courses on my CAO all that time ago. You know, really, I do think about, you know, the options of subjects that were available for me to choose from when I was in secondary school. So, you know, like any ancient mariner map, you'll always see that they carry the warning, "Here be dragons." And, you know, certainly I think as I reflect back to school, certainly, you know, the dragon was honours maths. And, you know, it certainly was, you know, while I had a great education there and an excellent secondary education, but it was a struggle, and really it was a bit of a fight to be allowed to do honours maths for the Leaving Cert. So we had a pretty large class there, as you can see from the photograph. But out of that class, only about 15 of us started in the honours maths stream, and only about half of us actually finished it and took honours math for Leaving Cert. Now, I certainly hadn't decided at that stage that I wanted to go into engineering, but as any engineers on in the audience would know, you know, certainly honours maths would be an entry requirement into an engineering degree. And you know, I think I was coming to the end of final year, and I was torn really between accounting and science. So no mention of engineering in there at all. And, you know, I really was influenced and had the great fortune to have an amazing chemistry teacher, Dr. Nuala Carroll. And, you know, she certainly started talking to me about the fact that she thought that engineering could be a really good option for me. She saw that I kind of had an inherent ability for problem solving, much more so than necessarily anything that you would think about from a traditional engineering perspective. And she organized out of her own time a tour for me in the engineering department in UCD. So I could just get a sense of, you know, what do engineering labs look like? What does an engineering department look like? And, you know, that was really a huge influence, and really kind of opened my mind to thinking about doing an engineering degree. And certainly without Dr. Carroll and her influence, I probably wouldn't have even thought about it when I was picking options for a third level. So, you know, I think that's, you know, a really key point, and is probably still very relevant to all girls' schools today, on how important the influence of teachers can be in encouraging young women into STEM courses, and not just engineering, but certainly considering and keeping engineering in mind. So I chose Trinity College as my first choice preference, mostly because I like the feel of the campus. And, you know, one of the other great things about the course was that it offered 2 years common engineering. So the choices were civil, mechanical, electronic, and computers. And, you know, in those first 2 years, it offered students exposure to several or all of those engineering disciplines. So you were doing classes and labs and lectures across all of the disciplines. So getting a really good sense of how your interest level was sparked by different content before you had to make a final decision about what engineering discipline that you would pick. And pictured on this slide, this brought back some great memories, but this is a beautiful picture of the stunning museum building, which was the home of civil engineering when I was in Trinity. And it certainly has some great memories for me. But I do remember queuing up those stairs, and at the top of the stairs where you see those notice boards, that's where they used to publish all of our final year exam results. So like very organized and well-disciplined engineering students, we used to queue up the stairs to get our results. And I don't know if it was a quirky sense of humor, but the lecturers used to make it really easy to find any failing results because they used to highlight them in red pen. So it was a bit terrifying when you got up to the top of the stairs. So I ultimately, after my first 2 years, went on to do mechanical engineering, and then I specified further in final year into mechanical and materials engineering. And like I mentioned there earlier on, there was no bioengineering or biomedical engineering courses in those days, and certainly they are very popular courses now, and I'll talk to that towards the end of my presentation. So as I mentioned there before, by fourth year, I had chosen mechanical and materials engineering. And you can see on the slide here, this is a really old picture of the Parsons building, which was the home of mechanical engineering in my time. So these were the days before the very substantial extension that's on the front of the building now. And you can see my class photo up there. I'm at the back up there on the left where the yellow arrow is, looking much younger than I am now. But, you know, I think this really was where I really started to see the opportunity in bioengineering as it was then. And, you know, I remember we were down in the labs, which were down in the bowels of the building, and we would have been doing tool room workshops and welding and machining, and we were looking at, you know, metallic grain structures under microscopes, and, you know, generally just making things and then probably breaking them on mechanical test equipment as part of our labs. And I remember an engineer arriving into the lab, and out of his bag, he removed a lower human leg, which was soaked in formaldehyde. And he had basically mounted it up on the Instron mechanical tester, and basically was loading the tibia to basically take a load measurement reading of when the bone fractured. And the reason that he was doing that was he was actually doing some design work into training shoes at the time. And it felt really interesting to me, and certainly a lot more interesting than looking at stainless steel. But certainly that was my first kind of real life exposure to the application of mechanical engineering in a bioengineering application as such. And you can see also here, there's a picture of Professor David Taylor on this slide. So while I was in Trinity, David had established the biomedical engineering research and development very strongly in the department at that stage. And certainly as we transitioned into final year, we had quite a lot of opportunities to do our final year project with a biomechanical twist. And I certainly took the opportunity to do that. My final year project was in conjunction with Kappa Hospital, and I was working on an adjustable orthosis design as part of my final year. And, you know, I think it's safe to say that really it was in Trinity that I caught the bioengineering bug. And, you know, I really do feel, you know, how strongly I look back fondly on that time, and, you know, how David Taylor certainly influenced the early stages of my career. And I certainly would consider him to have been a mentor in those early years. I probably felt at that stage that I was really comfortable in an academic environment. I absolutely loved my time in Trinity. I never really wanted to leave, I think. But you know, it really felt to me like that's kind of the environment that I belonged in, you know, moving on to do academic research. So from Trinity, I then moved on to a PhD study, moving now from Trinity to the University of Limerick. And I purposely went and found the old University of Limerick logo to put on this slide. Certainly reflected the time that I was there. And you know, part of the move to Limerick again was very influenced by Professor Taylor. You know, he certainly suggested to me that it would be far better for my own personal development to do a postgraduate study somewhere other than where I did my primary degree, you know, and to expand my horizons. So my PhD was spent doing a project that was looking at optimizing the acetabular cup. So that's one of the components. It's the component that fits into your pelvis as part of a total hip replacement. And at the time, you know, it was very topical because there was very high rates of acetabular cup loosening. And it was a leading cause of total hip joint failure at the time. So I went into this study and there was a very successful femoral stem. So the femoral stem here on this slide would, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but would be the metallic component that's shown on the top right picture of the slide. But this femoral stem was known as the Exeter femoral component. It was a Biomedical product and it had a very smooth surface finish. It was tapered. And on implant, it had the ability to self-center itself and to lock itself in location so that it naturally tightened into the femoral canal after implant. And that really supported the system to prevent loosening and to load both the bone cement and the surrounding bone in a very appropriate biomechanical fashion. So the thought at the time was that we could take that technology and apply it to the acetabular cup. So typically that was hemispherical in design. And, you know, I was looking at, well, what if we modified that geometry such that it had a taper and it was to be implanted in what was called the iliopubic bar of the pelvis, which was a very thick section of bone between the acetabulum and the iliac crest. So I spent a huge amount of my time doing lots of experimental subsidence testing with different shaped tapers, and ultimately brought that then into a validated finite element model to simulate how the new acetabular cup design might work. And, you know, ultimately at the end of all of this work, really what the research was showing us was that this was not going to work in the pelvis. If we put that much metal into the pelvic bone, it was going to adversely alter the natural loading patterns. And basically the implant would carry more of the applied loads instead of the bone structure itself, which would lead to stress shielding and ultimately would make component loosening worse and not better. So I think, you know, you always start off this type of work expecting to have a good outcome and hopefully a better device that's going to work better for patients. But in this particular instance, the research was just as important, telling us not to proceed because it would actually have a worse outcome for patients if we were to proceed with a design of this type. So I finished my time in the University of Limerick. So I spent about 4.5 years there, and I moved then from Limerick up to Galway to the National Centre for Biomedical Engineering Science, which is part of NUI Galway. And this was a massively exciting time for biomedical research. So the NCBES, the new centre, was brand new and it had just been awarded very substantial amounts of funding to establish a dedicated research facility for biomedical research. So certainly I was one of the first people in the building, and one of the tasks that I had was the acquisition and installation of the mechanical test equipment for the centre. So my main project was intended to be for research into coatings and coating development for stents. And I started that, but you know, I also had started a collaboration with some of the orthopedic surgeons in Merlin Park. We basically had such a wealth of fantastic equipment in the centre. You know, we were really looking at new ideas and new ways to use that equipment to basically come up with new projects, etc. And one of the areas of interest to the orthopedic surgeons at the time was the amount of strain in the sciatic nerve that was caused during total hip replacement. So there was quite high incidence of sciatic nerve damage as a side effect of having a total hip replacement. So we had some really nice equipment. We had a non-contact strain measurement system which used video extensometry, and we basically hooked it up over a gantry and joined the orthopedic surgeons in total hip replacement surgeries, and we were actually able to measure the strain in the sciatic nerve in vivo. So while the implant and the surgery was being done in a live patient, during knee flexion with the sciatic nerve exposed. So, you know, it was just a really fantastic time, and we were able to publish some really nice papers and collect some really nice data. And certainly, you know, when I look back now, and I was just looking at the website for the National Centre for Biomedical Engineering Science, they have over 400 researchers there now. So certainly, as a research centre, this has just grown and gone from strength to strength, which is just fantastic to see. For me, though, I was 6 years into the academic research career that I felt I had always wanted. And even though I was surrounded by a treasure trove of equipment and unending research opportunity, it just wasn't really turning out the way that I thought that it would. It was certainly really interesting, and I was getting to work directly with surgeons, but I just didn't feel like I had a connection or was really making any kind of a difference to patients at the end of the day. So there just, for me, wasn't that connection between the research that I was doing and having an impact on the quality of people's lives. So certainly I was chatting with the orthopedic surgeons, and they were kind of saying to me, you know, maybe you should go back and retrain in medicine. We could see you being a surgeon. And I wasn't quite ready to give up on engineering at that point. And, you know, an opportunity came up back in Limerick, in fact, back in Biomedical, who I had an association with from my PhD days. And I decided ultimately to return to Limerick and to get some industry experience. And, you know, at the time, I really felt that getting a couple of years of industry experience under my belt, you know, would be really good for me, and also would enhance a future academic career, because I thought, you know, if I went back into teaching at some point in the future, the chances were the majority of students that I would teach would end up working in industry as opposed to research. So I felt that it would be, you know, really beneficial for me to have some industry experience and understand what life was like as an engineer working in the medical device industry. So off I went. Orthopedics was always my first love, so it seemed like a perfect fit to go back and start working in Biomedical as it was then, and Stryker as it is known now. So I spent 3 years in Stryker in the product development department, working on custom implants. So I was a custom implant R&D engineer. I was working within a team of 3 engineers. We had a dedicated CAD technician and 3 manufacturing specialists who would manufacture the custom implants that we were designing. So as a team, we would have been producing approximately 200 custom implants per annum for worldwide use. And custom implants basically are a prescriptive implant for a named patient. So we would have been designing from x-rays, modifications to devices or customized devices where standard devices just wouldn't fit for that particular patient needs. So we would come up with a design having received x-rays from a surgeon, and working with the CAD technician, then we would get those new designs drawn up. They would be sent out to the surgeon to review, and if the surgeon was satisfied with them, they would then sign that off as the prescription, and we would then go on and manufacture, sterilize, and supply the device. So the rough time frame for all of that to happen was in the region of 3 to 4 weeks. So it was a pretty quick process ultimately, because, you know, we had people who had a pretty severe need for an implant and couldn't get something from a standard catalog. So it was very important that we were able to get something designed that would work for them and get it to them quickly. The team also then would have been producing about 100 specialty implants worldwide per annum. So it was a pretty busy group, and, you know, no two devices were the same. They were always for specific patients, so very much designed for that patient's need. Certainly my favorite project while I was working in the custom implant group was a pediatric implant. It was called the growing prosthesis. And, you know, I certainly would feel that this was my most fulfilling project while working in Stryker. So this was an implant that was designed for pediatric patients with a bone cancer diagnosis. So, you know, clearly this was a life-threatening condition for the child. So the first stage of their treatment was always to remove the bone tumor prior to life-saving cancer treatment. But of course, in removing the bone tumor, this would have been initially replaced with a fixed length implant. And that's similar to the approach that's taken for an adult with bone cancer. But of course, the challenge for a pediatric case is that the opposite unaffected limb continues to grow. So the growing prosthesis was an extendable prosthesis. It had a switch basically in the intercondylar space. So that's the little notch, the natural notch that's in your knee joint. And basically by hyperflexing the child's leg, the prosthesis was extendable, so it consisted of a telescopic inner shaft that was actuated by that intercondylar switch, and that caused the inner shaft then to extend via a threaded inner component using an internal gearing mechanism. So it was a really intricate device. It had about 30 different individual components that were all assembled together, sterilized and delivered. And as a team, we originally designed and delivered 5 of these devices for children in Austria. So I would have been the main project engineer for this product. And with the custom team, you know, we worked through the final development stages. What we got was a prototype design ultimately, and we brought it through to being a final design. Still a custom implant for those named pediatric patients. And we manufactured and assembled and performed all of the testing then on the device prior to delivery. So you can see here in some of the images, different views of the growing prosthesis. Some schematics showing the gearing mechanism, and then also the top image there. So apologies if you're not normally looking at medical device stuff, but this would have been an implant into the child's thigh of the growing prosthesis itself. And that was certainly one thing that I really enjoyed about working in this role was, you know, because we were working with custom implants, we were fortunate to be able to routinely attend surgery, and we certainly did so with the cases for the growing prosthesis. We had a lot of direct interaction with surgeons to find solutions for their patients when the standard product didn't fit, or indeed sometimes it was just a case where there wouldn't have been sufficient bone present to support a standard implant. So while I was doing all of that in Stryker, you know, there was obviously a huge variation in the type of design work that I was doing. And, you know, it did also allow me to continue participating at academic conferences. So certainly I would have presented the growing prosthesis design at conference. So I really still felt like I had my hand in both pies at this stage. So from Stryker, I then moved into a completely different device type. So I took a major detour then into active implantable devices. So I moved to Guidant in Clonmel, and that was ultimately acquired by Boston Scientific. Um, but completely different to the orthopedic devices. The products that were manufactured in Clonmel were at the time cardiac rhythm devices. They do a huge amount more, including neurostimulation devices in their portfolio now. But while I was there, the product portfolio would have included pacemakers for bradycardia, so that's where the heart is beating too slowly, tachycardia devices, that's where the heart beats too quickly, and also heart failure devices. So, you know, certainly from my perspective and from my background as a mechanical engineer, you know, these were really quite challenging devices. There was more electrical components in them than mechanical, but certainly it was a combination of both. But then you also had the complexity of embedded firmware and also software to basically, you know, the functionality of the device was to adaptively sense what was going on in the heart and then respond to that to treat whatever irregular heart rhythm was going on in that particular individual. So differently again to orthopedic devices, you know, these were life-sustaining and life-saving devices. So certainly, you know, up a notch or two in terms of dealing with situations where there were device defects or if something went wrong. So I was in Boston for quite a number of years and held quite a few different roles, which I think was really a key advantage and something that I saw as a real positive in the structure, certainly within Guidant, more so than when it transitioned into Boston Scientific. But I went into Boston in a supplier quality or tech transfer role where we were bringing hybrid assembly. So that was the printed circuit board assembly that was built into the pulse generator device across from the US. And I moved from that role then into a product performance role as an engineering manager, and then transitioned from that then into new product introduction also as an engineering manager, and from that then into a quality manager role. So I think really, you know, of those roles, I really did enjoy the product performance role probably the most. It could sometimes be pretty stressful. You know, what we were dealing with in that particular group was much more on the post-market side of things. So dealing with a lot of complaints investigations and failure analysis, also looking at adverse trends in device performance with our colleagues in the US. So, you know, even though we were involved in maybe what a lot of people would consider to be maybe the more negative end of the business, you know, when things go wrong, you know, there's just a huge opportunity then to also understand what's going wrong and fix them and make sure then that you're eliminating those types of failure modes for future device designs as well. So certainly I was involved in plenty of complaint investigation, risk management, you know, doing fielded product evaluation. And, you know, I was certainly in the thick of product recalls and remediation during my time there. But I definitely learned a huge amount in that role. And, you know, I think it's very important not just to focus on you know, the kind of altruistic element of the business where you really do feel like you're helping people, but you know, we do have to face the day-to-day reality in medical device development that things don't always work the way that we maybe have expected them to do, and that's particularly true in more complex product types. It's not unusual. A lot of people found it maybe a little unusual that I moved into a quality engineering role, but certainly with this type of device where there's a lot of complexity and you learn an awful lot as you move through different roles in the organization, that you will actually find quite a lot of engineers working in quality and regulatory roles in particularly high class medical device companies. And ultimately, that again is the next place that my journey was bringing me to, because I had moved into that quality senior management role. I was now essentially signing off and was responsible for the release of these products to the worldwide market for the CRM, or the cardiac rhythm management business. And I was spending quite a lot of my time face to face with auditors, with notified body auditors and regulator auditors like FDA and Visa, PMDA from Japan, etc. And, you know, I felt that it was really quite important for me at that point to understand more about the industry regulation. And that's really what prompted me to then go and do a master's in medical technology regulatory affairs. And I did that at Cranfield University. And, you know, I found that really interesting because it really provided context to a lot of the ways that we did things and the reasons why things were structured the way that they were within the business, that I didn't necessarily fully grasp why we did things the way that we did. But also, I think, you know, one of the other opportunities that doing that master's offered was the opportunity to look at areas of the business that I hadn't really any involvement with before. And the research project that I did as part of that master's was in the area of trying to understand opportunities to standardize the regulatory requirements for performing clinical studies worldwide, and to make them applicable to worldwide product applications. And, you know, certainly in my role so far at this stage, I had no exposure to clinical investigations. You know, Boston was predominantly a manufacturing industry. So while we were certainly doing very advanced process development, and, you know, I would certainly say that Ireland is definitely a leader in medical device manufacturing, process development, process efficiencies, etc. You know, we don't always have the same amount of opportunity to get involved in the very early design stages, and particularly in clinical investigations and those processes. So that was a great opportunity for me, stepping out to go and do that master's. So at this point, I was now more than the few years that I had expected to spend in industry before I went back into academia as I had originally planned. But I was loving my time in industry. I had now spent over 12 years working across orthopedics and active implantables. And certainly I felt I was starting to drift quite unconsciously into people management. And that's one of the opportunities, or the streams that engineers have in front of them, particularly in the multinational companies. But, you know, I suppose even though I really enjoy the interaction, working with some really phenomenal people in the teams that I worked with, it felt that I was spending more time in meetings and a lot less time doing engineering work. And I didn't feel like I was really learning anything anymore from a technical perspective. And then out of the blue one day, I got a really lucky phone call from an old team member who had been on the product performance team with me. And that ultimately is what led me to a startup. So Mainstay Medical was establishing a presence in Ireland at that time. It was a neurostimulation active implantable device, and it was looking for somebody to set up and manage their quality engineering group for the company. So they had just raised their Series B funding, and we're establishing a whole new entity in Ireland, and I joined them as employee number 2. And it was full of ex-Guidant people, which was really interesting. So it was a really tiny team. There was only about 4 of us at that stage, and I think we were 7 people by the time we got to a first in human clinical study implant. But between us, we had over 250 years experience when you lined us all up, which was really interesting. And I think that was something that was key to the success and how quickly we were able to move that product through the stages of design and development. So Reactivate itself is a novel active implantable neurostimulator device. It is designed to address chronic low back pain. for which there is no identifiable anatomical cause. So when you look at an MRI or a CT scan or an X-ray, in these patients, there's no slip disc, there's no obvious problem that's causing the low back pain. And that, of course, makes it very, very difficult to treat them. So Mainstay had identified that 80% of patients with chronic low back pain had atrophy or a wasting away of the multifidus muscle, which is the strongest stabilizer of the lumbar spine. And when you looked at the multifidus muscle in an MRI scan, you could see large fatty deposits where the muscle was disappearing and basically becoming infiltrated with fat and becoming less effective in doing its job as a stabilizer. So what was quite different about Reactivate as a neurostimulator device was how it operated. So the majority of spinal stimulators act to block pain signals as their mechanism of action. But Reactivate was designed to rehabilitate the problematic multifidus muscle to improve the muscle's function and thereby reduce pain and ultimately be a solution for the patient. So with Reactivate, there was 2 leads that were implanted adjacent on either side of the spine. And these were positioned next to the motor point of the multifidus muscle. And by stimulating that nerve, it caused the muscle to contract and wake up and essentially exercise the muscle from inside the body. So this was my first involvement in such an early stage company. So while I had, you know, an awful lot of experience interacting with clinicians, quality systems, process development and manufacturing, this was the first exposure that I had in real world preclinical and clinical studies. And, you know, to me, that's what I absolutely loved about it. It was really the great advantage in my mind of working in a startup that you really get to do lots of things that you've never done before and probably wouldn't have had an opportunity to do had you stayed in a large company. And, you know, there's really just one reason for that. And it's usually because there's basically more things to do than there are people to do them. So, you know, it was a real case of putting your hand up and volunteering to take on maybe an area that you hadn't worked in before, you know, and with that basically came a very steep learning curve. And you had to learn quickly and get it right quickly because there wasn't time to fail. So really exciting. By title, I was the director of quality for Mainstay Medical, but I was also covering areas like design verification testing. I was the owner and the audit rep for sterilization validation for usability and human factors engineering deliverables. And I would have written all of those sections in the regulatory submissions to get product approval for those areas. We created a quality management system from scratch. We got ISO 13485 certified through BSI first time around, and we brought the product through to first in human use within the first 2 years of being in the company, which was very, very quickly. And we ran that clinical study across Europe and also in Australia. And it was the data that was produced from that clinical study that allowed us to submit to get the product CE marked for market access to Europe. It was really eye-opening because, you know, again, the experience in a startup company for the first time, you know, I always felt that getting CE mark was the goal. Once you had done that, you'd won. You had market access. Now you could get out there and launch your product and, you know, start to grow the business effectively. But of course, you know, this was actually just basically the passport to grow the business. And, you know, there was a real kind of an eye-opening exposure to things like, okay, great, now you can put the product on the market, but you know, now you've got to go through all of the stages of reimbursement and health economic studies to convince people to actually pay for the product. So there is kind of real opportunities to learn in a startup in areas that you really don't know exists from, you know, a pure medical device design and production perspective. So it was just really interesting. And, you know, we had offices ultimately in the end in Ireland, the US and Australia. So the joke was there was always somebody working for Mainstay, regardless of the time zone or where you were. But it genuinely was really exciting. You know, you'd be working late at night and, you know, you would be looking forward to getting up and seeing what was in your inbox in the next morning to see, you know, what had somebody signed off, what had somebody actually gotten done the night before. So great times in Mainstay. Again, I really love the experience. It gave me a real flavor of not just the excitement, but the hard work, but also the rewards that you could get from working in a startup company. And we got CE mark for the product, as I said. We had submitted, we had done another very large clinical study for US FDA pre-market approval. And we had just submitted to FDA, and the company was starting to grow, and I was really starting to get itchy feet. We had gotten to the point, you know, where we were through all of what I would have considered to be the exciting design and development stages, and you know, we were starting to get into the nitty-gritty of dealing with suppliers on a day-to-day basis, and you know, product launch and quantities and supply chain. And I kind of really wanted to be back at the stage where we were designing and developing again. So really at that point, I felt it was time for me to go, and I took the brave or somewhat crazy step at that point to launch my own technical consulting company. So I started Triskel Consulting in 2018, and certainly my goal was to work exclusively with startup companies, and that is what I do. So far, it has been very busy and quite successful. But the areas that I work in are really predominantly design and development controls, quality and regulatory supporting new medical device startups. So there is just a real opportunity here because Ireland is one of Europe's largest medtech hotspots. It's certainly a globally recognized centre of excellence. It's home to hundreds of medical device companies, employing in excess of 45,000 people. It's one of the highest employers of engineers in Europe per capita, and certainly in Ireland. But what's really interesting is in the last, I would say 10 years or so, the Irish medtech business has changed, you know, so we still have a huge amount of world-class manufacturing going on, but there certainly has been a shift to where we're seeing a lot more design companies starting up. And certainly the Irish MedTech Association estimates that over 80% of companies are innovative active. So we have indigenous design of new products coming through in Ireland, which is just fantastic to see. There's certainly a vibrant startup ecosystem. Certainly there's space in an awful lot of the Irish universities where hubs and new business are starting in laboratory setups, and you know, we can see it through programs like BioInnovate, where we seem to be getting a very steady stream of really great new ideas for new biomedical applications, medical devices and biotechnology coming through on an almost routine basis at this stage. It's certainly very strongly supported. There's a good investment infrastructure to support R&D and innovation. So lots of really great new ideas coming through. And, you know, it felt to me like there could be an opportunity for me to have a business working with companies that were coming out with a great idea, but didn't necessarily understand the regulatory pathway and requirements to actually getting that great idea to turn into a medical device that you could submit for a product approval or a market access. So I suppose a couple of things about medical device startup companies. It doesn't matter how big or small you are, you have to meet all of the requirements, and medical devices must meet safety and performance requirements. These are set through the regulations. It is a highly regulated industry, and one of the phrases that certainly working with my clients that I think they've started to love to hate is the mantra, if it's not written down, it never happened. And that's certainly one of the FTA standard lines. The documentation and the importance of record keeping is absolutely essential and not to be underestimated. One thing that I do encourage, and I have certainly got huge value out of, is for a new idea for an early stage company is to go and talk to FDA, talk to the competent authorities or the notified bodies early. So I have seen new companies submit thinking that, you know, it's almost a tick the box exercise. You know, we have this great idea, all we have to do is to convince the regulator because, you know, there's so much opportunity, there's such a huge unmet clinical need that, you know, of course the company is going to get approval, or of course it's going to get acquired quickly, and that's just not the case. FDA and, you know, the competent authorities and the notified bodies, they have to be able to satisfy themselves that there is sufficient testing of devices to demonstrate that they are safe and are going to perform per the intended labeling and per basically what it is that you say the device is going to do. So I have seen companies submit, you know, too early to FDA, too early to the notified body, and then get wrapped up in long, complicated rounds of questions and answers and ultimately not get approval and then have to start the process again. FDA competent authorities are incredibly helpful, particularly in the pre-market approval stages, you know, and outline, you know, what their expectations are, and they give an awful lot of feedback. The access to them it's free. There's no monetary charge for it, and certainly it's something that I would encourage. A couple of other things to note about working in a medical device startup is that, you know, sometimes it's not for the faint-hearted. These are one product companies, so if it all goes wrong, it generally will go wrong pretty quickly. There's certainly no backup. So if you get a product approval, or you're starting to do first in human implants and you're starting to see failures, there is no other stream of revenue that's going to come that you can sell a different type of product or keep the business going. So all of your eggs essentially are in one basket. There's a lot of clinical research, clinical study work to be done, particularly with higher class devices, and these can take a long time and they can be very expensive. You know, the time that's required to collect this data and also the type of investment and extent of investment that's required is not to be underestimated. You need to implement quality systems pretty early. Certainly for innovative, creative engineers, this can feel like basically tying them up in a straitjacket, where all of a sudden they feel constrained by rules and regulations and having to write test reports and document things in a timely fashion. And it can feel very restrictive and confining, particularly to a very creative mind. These are all pre-revenue companies. TTLO is a phrase or an acronym that one of my prior CEOs would have used. So time to lights out. You only have as much money as you have. And, you know, if you're looking for job security, sometimes there's only 6 months of money left. And after that, if the CEO doesn't get more investment, you're out of a job. So, you know, it is exciting and challenging, but it's not without risk. And then you are Jack or Jackie of all trades, and that's just the reality of the situation. So, you know, you may have a really nice fancy title like CEO or VP of Quality and Regulatory, but at the end of the day, you're Jack of all trades. And I remember particularly Peter Crosby, who was the CEO of Mainstay, when he was interviewing me, he asked me about my expectations of working in a startup, particularly because all of my experience to date at that point was in large companies. And he was really clear that as a CEO, he could be suited and booted on a stage with international financiers on a Monday looking for investment and hobnobbing, you know, with some pretty high profile players on the financial stage. He could be traveling home on a Tuesday balancing, you know, his laptop on his lap, sitting in the back of the plane, and could be back in his jeans packing product with boxes on Wednesday. So, you know, being CEO or VP in a small startup company, it may sound glamorous, but the reality of it is, you know, you're just another pair of hands, and you know, there is nobody to delegate to. So from that point of view, you know, you need to be thinking about the fact it is very, very hands-on, and there isn't a whole lot of time off either. There isn't a whole lot of long holidays or taking bank holidays off when things have to be done and the team is very small. So I just have a couple of slides then around just high level, the product approval process, the design control phases. So, you know, these differ sometimes a little in terms of the numbering of the phases, but the main structures are driven directly out of the standards and the regulations. So every device is going to go through the phases of design inputs, design outputs, design verification, design validation, and design transfer. These are requirements and phases that that each medical device needs to go through, and we need to be able to demonstrate with objective evidence, i.e. documentation and records, that we have done all of these stages. So while all of the stages must be addressed, you can take different companies will take different approaches. They may combine phases together. For instance, they might do design inputs and outputs together as a combined phase, or design verification and validation together as a defined phase. So there's some flexibility, but you can't skip any of them. And also the sequence that you do them in is very important. So you have to establish design inputs first before you establish design outputs. You can't do design verification if you don't have your design inputs established. These are things that regulators will write major non-conformities for, or warning letters when they find that these things have been done out of sequence. So one thing that really influences the extent and also the length of time it takes to do the work is the device classification. So you can see just there on the bottom left of the slide, there's a very simple schematic showing the USA device classification, which is from class 1 to 3. And in the EU, we have class 1, 2A, 2B, and class 3. And equally then when you go to Australia, they have a 4-class system. Japan has a 4-class system. So unfortunately for those of us working in medical devices, each geographic region has its own approach to regulation of the industry and classification of devices. So you need to be able to adapt to that. And when you're doing your design and development work, make sure that the outputs are going to satisfy multiple different regulatory regions to avoid having to repeat it. So the higher the risk of the device, so the class 3s will be higher risk, the higher the burden of data requirements to show safety and efficacy and performance. So for instance, class 1 devices will not need to have clinical data to support an application for market access, where class 3 devices always will require a clinical study. And with changes in the EU with the medical device regulation, we've seen class 2B devices will have an expectation of having clinical data associated with them as well. A clinical evaluation would be required for all classifications, but actual clinical studies would be required just for the higher risk ones. So depending on the class of the device, you're going to have to do more work the higher the risk classification to be able to meet the regulatory requirements. Design and development is controlled under quality management systems. So that brings in all of the elements of things like good documentation practices, compliance, and following a structured process. And as I mentioned earlier, then the sequence and the order activities is critical, and it is checked during audit and also during the review of technical files when they're submitted for product approval. Usability and human factors. It's become increasingly important to understand how users make human error when they interact with the devices. And, you know, the intent here is for us as design engineers to understand what those user interactions can be in terms of use environment, and how the user interacts with the device, be that how they interact with the instructions for how they're to use the device, or if there's some kind of a software interface, etc. And to try and understand what ways can they interact with the device where they will use it incorrectly, and then to try and design out those opportunities for use errors. So usability engineering is a design input requirement, but to be honest, was largely ignored to an extent by the regulators when they were approving devices. That certainly has all changed in the last 5 years, and certainly if you were to submit something to FDA now without human factors or usability engineering analysis, you would just get a flat out rejection. So it's really important to factor into the design cycle. And, you know, ultimately then the goal, particularly with a higher class device, is to get all the way to clinical investigation studies. So on the bottom right here, you can see this is a fluoroscopy image of an implanted reactivate device. So you can see the 2 leads there on either side of the spine. So this is actually an image from one of the first 50 patients that was a clinical subject participating in the first human clinical study for the device. But on the way to clinical investigation study approval, which is managed again through the regulators and the competent authorities, you need to demonstrate at a minimum that the device is safe to be allowed to implant that into a human. And, you know, some of the minimum requirements to demonstrate that are biocompatibility studies and typically preclinical or animal studies to show that there are no adverse effects from implanting the device. So just looking at each of these phases in a little bit more detail. So the proof of concept phase is typically done first. And, you know, this is outside of quality system control. So there's no specified requirements here or documentation required necessarily, but it's a really good idea to keep records of decisions that are made and what you've learned, and these all feed into the formal design controls process. So a lot of the time in proof of concept, you know, you've got engineers and designers out there, and they're establishing what the clinical need is. They're talking to clinicians about what challenges them with the current devices that they have, or where there's a gap. Interestingly, in this phase, one of the questions that I'd be typically working with my clients on is, first of all, checking with them that what they're working on is in fact a medical device or something else. So sometimes, particularly in software development, depending on the intended use, what people think they're working on as a medical device is not actually a medical device at all. So that's something definitely to get straightened out at the early stage. And from the original idea, then, you know, there would typically be some early stage testing just to verify, does the concept work? Does it achieve what you want it to do by early design? So you might be doing some really early prototype work, getting a prototype into the hands of the clinician, you know, trying to figure out, can you actually make it? Is it even possible to do so? And can you get it to do what you want it to do? Importantly, then, you need to go through the whole process of establishing if there's freedom to operate and checking for existing patents and intellectual property. There's certainly no point in developing a device that you're not going to be able to legally market as your own, because you'll just spend years basically tied up in legal challenges. And also then very important to understand what the regulatory pathway is. So that's important at this stage, to just try and estimate what are you going to have to deliver to get this product approved. And, you know, for instance, is it going to require a lengthy clinical study? Because that could take many, many years, and that has a huge influence then on how much money you're going to raise to fund the project. Which brings then to the next stage of investing. Where's the money going to come from? And then very importantly, also looking at, you know, what are the skills and competencies that are required to turn this idea into an actual tangible product. So as I said earlier, one of the huge advantages that Mainstay had in developing Reactivate in the early days that allowed the team to be so small was because there was a vast amount of active implantable medical device knowledge within the group. And certainly when I would talk to my clients for the first time, this is when they're usually really excited. They've just gotten some investment. They've got, you know, a great idea. They've made a couple of prototypes. It seems to work. They've got some investment, and, you know, they kind of feel like they're at the end and they're nearly there. And unfortunately, this is just the end of the beginning. And this is where the really hard work starts. So from this point now, we're starting to get into formal design controls and establishing design inputs and outputs. And, you know, now we're into a very heavy regulatory rules laden process. So design inputs is the stage where the functional, performance, usability and safety requirements are established according to the intended use of the device. And sometimes it can be very challenging to even get that completely nailed down. What is the intended use of the device? Where in the body is it going to be used? And what is the mechanism of action that it is going to follow to achieve its clinical purpose? Part of design inputs is also then looking at a multitude of different things, including, you know, what standards exist that are applicable to the type of device that the company is trying to develop. Really starting to look at risk management, hazard analysis, but considering also other devices that may be similar that are already on the market, and you know, particularly looking at how they have performed, and, you know, especially where and why they may have failed. So that's all really useful input into establishing you know, what it is your device is intended to do, and, you know, helping to define the properties then, be they mechanical, electrical, clinical, etc., that is going to deliver the intended use of the device. Design outputs then are drawings, components, manufacturing instructions, software applications, etc. And a lot of the time when I start working with an early stage startup company, they're already producing drawings, but they haven't actually established what the intended use of the device is, and they haven't established what the functional, performance, usability and safety requirements are. So it's very important at that point that we take a step back and get things produced in the right order so that we're going to be compliant, and then also that we make sure that when we produce a drawing to get something manufactured or design a component to do something, that it's going to meet whatever the functional or performance requirement that was established. So what we don't want to do is to establish specifications based on what we can make, as opposed to making something that is going to do what it needs to do when it's implanted or being used in a patient. The next phases then are design verification and design validation. These are really important stages of the product life cycle. So verification means confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence, the dreaded documentation, that specified requirements have been fulfilled. So did we design the device right, ultimately? So examples of verification testing are mechanical testing, electrical testing, software validation, biocomp, shelf life testing, etc. Design validation then is establishing by objective evidence that design specifications conform with user needs and intended uses. So did we design the right device? Is it actually solving the problem that we set out to solve? And examples of validation testing are usability, human factors testing, preclinical or animal studies, and human clinical investigations. And all of this testing must be risk-based, it needs to be statistically valid testing, and it needs to use representative finish device designs. And ultimately then, if you get all of that done, you'll typically have submitted to get your CE mark or your FDA approval at the end of the design validation stage. And while you're going through the approval process, answering any questions that the regulator may have, you're working on transfer to manufacturing. So, you know, you're really starting to look at establishing the final manufacturing procedures to be able to manufacture at volume, process validation, process capability. What kind of scrap levels are you going to have? Can you rework product? You're looking at practical things like sterile lot releases, sales training for your sales force, clinician training for wider scale market launches, planning post-market surveillance follow-up, closing off your risk management file, your usability engineering file, and finalizing your device master records and your device and your medical device file, hopefully with a view to signing declarations of conformity prior to putting your product on the market. Again, to be realistic about it, from starting into design inputs, you're looking realistically at 8 to 10 years to first regulatory approval. And particularly that would be longer where you have a higher risk or higher class device that's going to also require clinical studies to support getting that device on the market. So just a few closing points. You know, I think it's really interesting. We've seen a huge emergence of biomedical engineering degrees since I graduated. Certainly as an engineering discipline, it seems to be breaking barriers. Within the bioengineering discipline, you know, we see a much more even gender divide between male and female graduates coming out, which is fantastic. And, you know, that stands out quite sharply when you look at the more traditional engineering streams, where we still have only about 1 to 20% of female graduates coming out of the mechanical, civil, traditional streams. So there seems to be something that is far more attractive to female students going into biomedical engineering. Certainly, as I reflect on my own career so far, the importance of mentors at all stages, you know, from my school days and actually deciding to go into engineering and through to, you know, the early support in my career has been really important to me, and certainly something if I get contacted by a young engineer and ask for some help or a little bit of guidance, or even just, you know, be a listening ear, I certainly try and give them some time and return that service to them. I do think we're really fortunate in Ireland. There is a growing population of entrepreneurs in the medtech sector. And, you know, I think that's going to secure the industry going forward. We're certainly world leaders in the space of medical device manufacturing. And, you know, with further investment in new medical devices, that will only continue to grow the industry in Ireland and, you know, provide great opportunities for engineers going forward. So again, Ireland may be small, but we have really strong networks and great information sharing, and that's a key strength for this industry and many others as well. And, you know, I think, you know, when I think back to when I was finishing college, I really did expect to go do a PhD, go into lecturing, do lots of R&D work within an academic environment. And, you know, it was really challenging and really, really interesting, but I also found that there was great opportunities to do R&D work outside of the academic environment. And, you know, even though what I'm doing now seems really quite different to what I thought I would do when I started, essentially I'm still working in medical device R&D work, just not in an academic environment. And certainly, you know, I do feel now that I'm working on devices that are available to patients reasonably quickly, and I can certainly see the patient interaction from the work that I do. So there is lots of opportunity, and I think, you know, one of the key elements that's there is you can always change your mind, and engineering is a fantastic career from that point of view, because you're only really as limited as your imagination will take you. You can apply the principles really to anything across the sphere of technical development. So I'm going to leave it there. This last slide is a picture of me, probably a more traditional image of a mechanical engineer. So this is a replica steam train at Wadi Rum station in Jordan, actually, after a great trip to Petra. So yeah, you never know where a journey might take you. So Mary, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, Suzanne, that certainly was an unexpected and extraordinary journey. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. You know, genuinely, thank you. I'm so glad we shared lunch one day in Engineers Ireland, Clyde Road, and you know, that I've had the opportunity to invite you to the Southeast region. So thank you so much.